is 120 Irish passengers in third class, only 4 in second class. This really gives us a good picture of what the demographics were like. And very close in numbers were British, 118. So you can pretty much rest assured that it was close to what you've always imagined, Irish and British mostly. However, look at that number of Swedish, 113 Swedes in third class. That's pretty significant. That's 1/7 of the passengers were Swedish. And then there were a couple in second class as well. There were 81 people from Syria on board in third class, 59 from Finland, still very significant, and 44 from Austria-Hungary, 33 Bulgaria, and 27 Russians. There were 25 Norwegians on board. And then, of course, I know you know where this is headed. In a few months, this series is going to focus on the amazing documentary that's soon to come out to the public, The Six. There were 8 Chinese in third class, and then 8 Turkish passengers in third class, and there were Danish, French, Canadian, German, Greek, Swiss, Italian, Portuguese, South African, Australian, and then there were a few Belgian and Spanish passengers in second class. Now, one of the ways to really sort of get a good deep dive on the numbers here is to look at who survived. This is very telling of the disparities between first class and certainly third class, and even second class and third class. To begin with the women and children first philosophy, the approach that was taken with filling the lifeboats with women and children only first, there were about 20% of the men that survived overall. So that's not very many men at all, and that applied in all classes. So you can see this huge disparity here. In first class, there was 1 child that passed away, and it was actually due to some miscommunication and some disorganization between a nanny and the family for whom she worked. And that child would have made it off, but there was some confusion, and so she and her mother passed away, and the mother was part of the 4 people who were female in first class that did not survive. So of 141 women in first class, 137 survived, almost everyone. In second class, the numbers dip a little bit, but they're still pretty significantly higher in survival rate than third class. 78% of 92 women survived, and all the children survived. But then you get to third class, where the immigrants were mostly traveling in third class. 88 of 179 women survived, and only, this is what's truly sad, is 25 children survived out of 80. So just a little bit more than 1/3 of the children. And ironically, these were the people that had they had the most work getting on board. They had to go through an inspection process. They had to work harder, of course, to be able to earn their fare to travel. And then when they left, for instance, Southampton, where most of them probably left from, they had to go through a special inspection to check for things to make sure that they were fit to travel. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about Dan Coxon. He had an arm that was shorter on the left side, and his brothers who took him to board the Titanic shared with the investigation team, the English Inquisition. They shared about how he had really been scrutinized by the inspectors in Southampton because of his shortened arm. And that's one example of what these folks in third class experienced. This is the inspection card of Katie Gilnaw, who was from Ireland, and a young gal, probably about 17 years old, and very representative of those young people that were aboard the Titanic trying to make a new life in America. And Katie did survive. Once they got to the United States, they were checked again at Ellis Island. If the Titanic had been able to make it across the Atlantic Ocean, which she almost did, they would have been checked at Ellis Island for trachoma, which is a eye infection that's highly infectious, and it can lead to blindness, cholera, a fungus of the scalp and nails, tuberculosis, and mental impairments were checked there. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to get, first we're going to get a look at what life was like in first class as a point of reference to compare life in third class. First of all, one of the main differences was the dining accommodations. There were 4 areas where you could eat aboard the Titanic in first class, whereas in second and third class, there was one specific area. In first class, you could eat in the main dining saloon or in the a la carte dining room. And I know that the Deeper Dive series is going to take a look at a couple of people who worked in the a la carte dining room in a few months. I'm excited about that. Also in the Café Parisien and the Veranda Cafe. This is a photograph that we are so fortunate to have, an actual photograph aboard the Titanic taken by Father Brown, who took the photos before he disembarked the Titanic. This is the Café Parisien. Those windows on the right side actually opened up so people could have an open air experience eating. And doesn't that look inviting with the mirrors on the wall and the wicker furniture? This is the Veranda Cafe and Palm Court Cafe. And these were both identical rooms that were located in the back of the promenade deck. They were decorated specifically to give the look and feel of large country houses and the gazebos that you would experience there. The first class passengers ate off a lot of the china that had been made for the Titanic in Stoke-on-Trent. And if any of you have been to Stoke-on-Trent, give a thumbs up or put it in the chat box. I would love to hear from you if you've been to Stoke-on-Trent. It's a really special place in England, and at least 2 sets of spode dishes that were made there were aboard the Titanic. This is one example of the spode dishes. And also, this is my favorite pattern of Titanic dishes next to the third class dishes that I'm going to show you in a minute. But this is the Royal Crown Derby design, and I love it because it's just so bright and crisp, and I love the color green. This is a pattern that you probably most identify with as iconic of the Titanic. This is the wisteria pattern, also produced in England. Here is a look at some of the silverware or flatware. On the right side, you see some of the flatware that was pulled from the resting site of the Titanic. And on the left side, you see some of the replicas that are still available today. You can buy replicas through Selfridges and probably other distributors. And this is the Arthur Price design. Arthur Price was asked to make the first class design of some of the silverware. There were several different patterns. And so, yeah, if you like that, you can find that today. Here's another example of first class flatware. And then the food. That we're so fortunate to have menus from people who tucked a menu away in their pocket on the way off the ship, or during lunch the day of the disaster, so that it was still in their lunch, in their jacket pocket that they ate at lunch. And we also know a lot about the foods from letters that were written home by people like Adolfo Zalfeld, who wrote about the first class lunch that he ate on April 10th when he first boarded the Titanic at Southampton. This first class lunch menu features some really neat items. There's brill mutton chops, there's shrimp, soused herrings. It just all sounds so wonderful and delicious. And the one thing that's different here about this menu from what you would see with third class is that it is a separate menu just for lunch. In third class, all of the meals of the day were on one piece of paper. So I'll show you that in a few minutes, but keep that in mind. And then at the bottom, I wanted to highlight the beer. The one thing that we know for sure about the beer aboard the Titanic was that it was by Wrexham Lager. It's spelled Wrexham, and it's an English brewery. And we only know about that one. I'm not aware of any others. If you know of some other beer providers, write that in the chat box. I would love to hear about that. But we can pretty much assume that that's what was served also in steerage in third class. So this is a first class luncheon menu. And here it is, the phenomenally celebrated last first class dinner aboard the Titanic on April 14th. And I know that so many of you know it well. It began with hors d'oeuvres, oysters, there were soups, salmon, and multiple different courses for entrees, meats, lamb, roast duckling. There was chateau potatoes. There was cold asparagus. There were a lot of different spring ingredients aboard the Titanic because it was springtime. So lots of different things. There was spring cabbage. There was lamb and so forth. So we see that on the menus in first and second class, not so much in third class. Another huge difference there. For dessert, Waldorf pudding, peaches and chartreuse jelly, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, and French ice cream. So just a really decadent dessert. This is what the menu would have looked like with its cover there on the left. And I want to share this with you. This is one of my favorite of all the menus that we're fortunate to have from the Titanic. This was saved by Elise Lurat, and she lived in Paris. There she is on her apartment balcony in Paris. And I just thought it was so neat. I wanted to share this with you because on April 12th, she was going to lunch and getting ready to decide what to eat. She had crossed out the egg dish on the left and also the Welsh rarebit. So I thought this would be a really neat thing to share with you. And then down below, you can see a couple of really neat menu options that are telling of the times. There's Milton Mowbray pie and also lamb with mint sauce. Lamb was very popular, of course, because of the springtime. Although I will say that the Titanic was very representative of all seasons. There was roast turkey and cranberry sauce served in second class and lots of apples. So if you want to plan something to host for a fall memorial celebration or something like that, apples are definitely something you can consider as well. At the very bottom there above the beer, you can see the cheese assortment, and the cheeses are very telling as well, because this assortment shows up on all of the first class luncheon menus that I've seen. So it tells us a lot about what were the trending cheeses at the time. You know, like I think of cheeses now that are so popular, like drunken goat cheese and a lemon buffalo ricotta and all those great things that you find at Whole Foods. And this is the assortment that was very prevalent then. So now we're going to compare this to what life was like in third class. So the Titanic changed everything. And that is one of the other reasons it is so memorable and still so very relevant today. Right before the Titanic, the passengers traveled in very harsh conditions. Life in all three cabins aboard the Titanic was way better than what it had been on steamships before the Titanic. Before the Titanic, steerage passengers were called steerage because they were housed on the deck where there were steering ropes. And many of them, in many cases, they had to bring their own food for the whole family for as long as a couple of weeks. Because sometimes if the weather was bad, it would take longer than a week to cross the Atlantic Ocean to get to New York City or to wherever they were going. So I wanted to ask you all, if you think about what would you pack if you were traveling in, say, 1880 as a steerage passenger, an immigrant from Ireland or England or some other country, what would you pack for 2 weeks so that your family would have enough food to eat? If you want to write your comments about that in the chat box, I would love to hear from some of you about what you would like to share with all of us about that. They were issued a fork, a spoon, and a tin lunch pail. And you know what? They had to wash those up at the end of every meal in the same bucket. So you can imagine hundreds of people trying to wash their dishes in the same bucket. And there was a huge rush to try to be one of the first in line so that they didn't have to wash their dishes in the dirtier water. So one of the huge differences in the Titanic was that this was no longer the case. They had meals provided to them. The service was very different, and I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But one of the main differences is that before the Titanic, they had their meals served in their dormitory. Like you see here in this picture, the arrow is pointing to the table, and they would just eat sort of right where they slept and so forth. But here is the third class dining room aboard the Titanic. And it's pretty nice the way it's set up. There were windows that people could see a little light through. Here's a depiction from one of the movies about the Titanic. And this is a picture I wanted to share with you of the dishes that they ate off of. This is a pretty iconic set with the teacup, the fork, to give you an idea of what that looked like. Their accommodations sleep-wise were the same in elevation as well, very elevated from what they had experienced prior to the Titanic. And they still shared accommodations in many cases. However, in in second class as well, they would share accommodations in some cases. And this is what a third class cabin would have looked like. And before I go on to tell you a little bit about Dan Coxon, I want to share a little bit about the major difference in the menus while we're stepping into the topic of food and so forth and the eating customs in third class.
Veronica, do you want to hear what people are thinking they would bring along with them?
Yes, thank you, Kim. I'm so glad people are responding. That's
no, great. People are responding. A lot of people are saying, I have no idea. One gentleman said some kind of pasty, which I think is a fantastic idea. Lots of preservatives, dried fruits, nuts. I personally opted for hard cheese and apples. Is another thing that's said. So, oh, and Jill wants to know what's a pasty, and I'll let you explain that. You know what a pasty is, right?
Yes, a pasty is, they're actually, that reminds me of my grandmother because she grew up in Upper Michigan, and they're basically pies. Correct me if you're thinking about something else out there, but they're a pastry dough with filling inside that's savory, potatoes and meat and onions in some of them, and they were hand pies, basically. It's like a hand pie. And those would be great to bring if you made them with potatoes. Those would be a wonderful thing to transport. Thank you so much for those of you that shared your thoughts. I was really anxious to hear from you about what you would bring. So Dan Coxon is one of the people in third class who was traveling back from London after visiting his family. He grew up in London in St. Pancras, and he had gone to Wisconsin many years earlier to make his life as an immigrant as a popcorn vendor and peanut vendor. He was also a caretaker of a historic mansion. This is a picture of Dan's popcorn wagon. And this is the mansion where pretty much the only person who lived in this beautiful Queen Anne style mansion on the high banks overlooking the Wisconsin River in Merrill, Wisconsin was Dan for a time, because there was a series of unsolved mysteries that happened related to this mansion, and it was actually demolished last year. But Dan was a caretaker there while he was establishing himself in Wisconsin as an English immigrant. And he was, of course, one of the people that people looked at when the Titanic disaster happened, and what they wondered, is the curse on this house somehow related to what happened on the Titanic? The Titanic was not supposed to sink. So people were just grasping everywhere for what reasons might have been the cause of the sinking. And this house was purportedly cursed. There was a string of different things that happened to owners of the house and people that were involved with the house. And if you want to look it up online, it's called the T.B. Scott Mansion in Merrill, Wisconsin. And Dan was a caretaker there. He earned enough money and he saved enough money as caretaker of the T.B. Scott Mansion to build his own house. And not only his own house, but the house next door, which, very savvy, as most immigrants were at that point, to build two houses, one right next door to the other. And the second house was even more beautiful, and he rented that house out. And that's the savviness of immigrants then and today that I'm referring to, of how you really need to be inventive when you're in a situation like he was in, to establish yourself in a new country with no contacts. Imagine you don't know anybody. You have to start your own way forward of your, building a business or working in a job. And he ended up building this house. This house as well was taken down a few years ago. This is money that we believe was probably Dan's, because it says Merrill on it. And this was found at the Titanic resting site. And Dan did not survive. Dan was one of the men in third class who did not survive the sinking. And his body, if it was recovered, was never identified. When I first looked at this, I thought, wait a minute, how can it say Merrill? Isn't money printed at the mint? Well, guess what? In 1912, when Dan traveled aboard the Titanic, money was printed at local banks in towns like Merrill. Dan would have been issued a menu card like this one each day. And this is one of the big differences that I mentioned earlier, that instead of having a menu for each meal, third class received a menu for each day with all of the meals on it. And what's really neat, I think this is so clever, speaking of being inventive, the White Star Line had a great marketing idea. They made these double as postcards. So people would send them to their family and friends from, if you got on board in Southampton, and when the boat docked at Queenstown, which is now Cobh, or Cherbourg, France, they could mail their postcards and share with people about what a wonderful time they were having aboard the Titanic. And this is one of the only surviving menus from third class on the day of the sinking, and April 14th, the date there you see. What's really interesting, I was getting to this earlier and I'm going to talk about it now. The huge difference is that you see dinner in the middle of the day. We don't call it dinner now, we call it lunch at noon. But back then, people in third class called it dinner because it was for sure the most decadent, wonderful meal of the day next to breakfast. And it was called dinner. And then the evening meal was called supper. And supper was a very light meal. And this menu represents that. It was cabin biscuits, cheese. Breakfast was also very hearty. There was oatmeal, herrings, jacket potatoes, ham and eggs, bread and butter, Swedish bread and marmalade. And then for that middle meal, my grandparents ate like this because they were direct descendants of immigrants. A beautiful rice soup, bread, cabin biscuits, roast beef and brown gravy, sweet corn, boiled potatoes, and plum pudding with sweet sauce. And then for high tea, something to hold them over until the supper in the evening, there were cold meats, cheese, pickles, bread and butter, and something I actually love to make this now to honor the Titanic, stewed figs and rice. I like to jazz it up with different ingredients to make it taste really neat. And then, of course, tea. And then for supper, there's the arrow pointing to the gruel and cabin biscuits and cheese. The gruel probably looked something like this. And gruel is pretty much a watered down porridge made from anything from rice to oats to barley ground up and stewed into water. So not the most pleasant of menus. At the very bottom, we see the of the menu, we see the notice that it says, let's see if I can go back and read. There we go. It basically points people to look for the steward with a numbered badge if they have any complaints. And the steward, the person that had the number 32 badge was Thomas Mullen. He was 21 years old, and he was from Dumfries, Scotland, the same area as John Hume, who was first violinist aboard the Titanic, and he was also from the same town as Robert Burns. Another really interesting item that is seen on the third class menus is tripe. And I really wanted to delve into this. I wanted to take a deeper dive, if you will, into what is tripe. And it's basically one of the stomachs of a cow. A cow has, I think, 3 stomachs, and it's one of them that is cooked down with really great spices and milk, and it looks like this. This is a recipe that's in my book, The Lesson on the Titanic, from my friend Sonia Geyer, who generously shared her grandmother's recipe for tripe and onions. And you can see that it has a whole bunch of different ingredients to make it taste good. Bay leaves and so forth. So a quick look at second class. There were 285 people, and many also were immigrants. Kate Buss is one of the women who was traveling alone. A great example here. She was coming to America to join her fiance, Sam, in San Diego. Sam had emigrated from England a few years earlier. He was a carpenter. And she wrote a letter home to her brother, Percy, that's gotten a lot of attention over the years about the things that she shared to Percy. She says, I've been quite all right, but now feel dead tired. And we use that expression still today, don't we? And more fit for bed than anything. And she says, I have to go to dinner tea in half an hour. She also wrote home that 2 clergymen who ate across from her advised her to eat a good lunch. Well, what's interesting is that she buddied up with a couple of women who were in the same situation she was in as immigrants. Marion Wright was going to America from England to join her fiance, Arthur Woolcott. And Arthur had already, just like Kate Buss's fiance, had gone to America a few years earlier, about 5 years earlier, and he had worked as a draftsman in Oregon. But by the time the Titanic sailed, he had already raised his lifestyle to where he was able to purchase an 80-acre fruit farm in partnership with a friend. They worked together in collaborations in the Willamette Valley near Cottage Grove, Oregon. And so both of those ladies survived the Titanic. And here is a beautiful picture of Marion and Arthur at their wedding. They were able to get married. And this is the area where Marion and Kate would have eaten their meals in second class. They would have eaten off china like this. And here's an example of one of their menus. I would start out with a consomme. Consomme was super popular then, and most meals started with it. And let me go back here. Let's see. I don't know where my controls went here. Let's see. Fried potatoes, kidneys and bacon, grilled sausage, mashed potatoes, buckwheat cakes with maple syrup. It doesn't sound bad at all. And that's a really good example too of a menu that was how it looked when it was saved. Again, a lot of those menus were tucked away from that they survived because people tucked them away in their pockets. Here's a breakfast menu, and soda scones are featured at the bottom, and that's how I landed on tonight's recipe for tonight. I wanted to create some soda scones, especially considering the huge number of Irish and English immigrants in third class. And I thought, well, what kind of soda scones can we make? And I thought, I want to make it a little more interesting than just plain soda scones like they would have had on the Titanic. So I thought of rhubarb. Rhubarb is in season, and it was on 2 of the different crew menus. This is one of the handwritten menus that the officers ate for lunch, the meal that the officers had. And again, this doubled as a postcard. Crew members could send this to their family. Here is rhubarb again on the April 3rd menu. And you might look at that date and say, wait a minute, Veronica, you might be off a little bit there in your dates because it says April 3rd and the Titanic didn't leave Southampton until April 10th, right? But this was for the second day of Titanic sea trials. And for the April 2nd and April 3rd sea trials, and probably more, the officers were treated to a fabulous meal at lunchtime. It started with a tomato consomme, halibut, supreme chicken on the Stanley, roast duckling, French beans. They really treated them great. Quail on toast, and there we see the rhubarb tart. Rhubarb also appears in a jam on the second class menu aboard the Baltic, which was also part of the White Star Line in 1910. John Bartram introduced rhubarb, or is credited for introducing rhubarb to the United States in the 1730s. And you can still go to see Bartram's garden in Philadelphia. Here's a picture of what it looks like. If you could take a few minutes again and write in the chat box, have you grown rhubarb? Have you cooked with rhubarb? Or what is your rhubarb story? This is the season for it. And the reason I love it so much is because it's such a fleeting season. We just have a couple of weeks where you can get rhubarb here in the Midwest. I don't know how it is where you folks are living, but here in the Midwest, you have to make calls to Whole Foods. And I went to pick up the rhubarb to make the scones for tonight on Saturday. And I swear it was like a speakeasy where people had to know to ask for the stash in the back. It was so funny. Benjamin Franklin wrote to John Bartram about rhubarb. He said, I received your letter with a parcel of seeds, and I'm sending you some of the true rhubarb seeds that you desire. So that was pretty neat in 1770. This is the recipe that I developed for tonight and for sort of a signature, one of the signature recipes of the Deeper Dive series, roasted rhubarb scones with fresh cream and mint. And I've got a couple of different mints here tonight. I have regular mint, and then I also have something kind of fun that I knew you all would appreciate, and it's mojito mint for your cocktail garden. So you can kind of have fun with these scones and dress them up with a little bit of mojito mint, and maybe have mojitos with your scone when you have people over to enjoy them. I've got a couple of different creams. There is the fresh cream that's featured in this recipe, which is heavy whipping cream, whipped in sugar. And also, what's really fun to do is to buy a treat for yourself, some clotted cream. And a clotted cream is like a thicker, creamier cream. It's almost like a butter. It really is very decadent. So with the recipe here, I made some scones in advance to show you all. I like to use my English china when I have people in for a special Titanic meal with scones, because it's nice to think about those dishes that were aboard the Titanic and what we have available to us today. Let's see here. Oh, I'm going backwards. There we go. Okay, so these are the directions for the scones. When I made these, I peeled the rhubarb, cleaned each stalk, and then very thinly peeled away the outer coating of each stalk of rhubarb, each piece. And I wanted to share these photos so you can see I peeled them very finely. And then I stewed the rhubarb or roasted it, and just in a cast iron skillet like this. I love to cook in a cast iron skillet with brown sugar and butter for about a half an hour, and you have roasted rhubarb. And then I mixed the dough together. Scones are such an easy recipe, as you know. And I mixed everything together, and I took the stewed rhubarb. It looks like this. And I mixed it in by hand with the dough, and then put it in the skillet, put it in the oven for about 30-40 minutes. When it started to brown up, I took it out, and I ended up with this. There's my mojito mint and my fresh cream. I also love to make rhubarb custard pies. That's one of the things that was on the Titanic for the crew, was rhubarb and custard. There's a nice picture there. And here is my contact information. And what I think I'll do here, we've got about 15 minutes remaining. I'm going to go back to the recipe and start making the scones and demonstrate how that's done while I take your questions.
So Veronica, the one question I have hanging out here is from Ramon, who would like to know if you have any information about where children and the bereaved dined and how prolific their meals were. That's a big question. He also asked, did you present at Chicago's Violet Hour a few years ago?
Ramon, were you there at the Violet Hour? Because that was probably me. Yes.
Don't know.
Yeah.
He says yes, he was there.
Oh, it's great to see you, Ramon. Yes, and what a special night that was. We had a holiday celebration, and they did such a wonderful job there with bringing everyone together. And so it's great to see you. And I want to answer your question about, can you repeat it, Kim,
Sure.
about the bereaved?
Yeah, it was a big question, and I omitted some things that were in parentheses, so I'll read the whole thing. If you have any information about where children, such as the Carters in first class and the bereaved, here I'm thinking of the Ryerson family, dined and how prolific their meals were, I'd love to hear about it.
Got it. Okay. And I'm thinking that they ate, as far as I know, I haven't heard anything differently. And I'm going to be baking here while I'm talking. I am pretty sure they ate with their parents. And they would have eaten, like the Ryersons probably ate with their parents, or possibly, now that I've never thought about that, Ramon, and I'm thinking they probably ate in their cabins with their nannies. The Ryersons, I would think, and the name of the other, the Carters, I would think they ate in their rooms, because you know, we don't know. That's a really good point. I want to look into that more. I would assume that they probably ate a little earlier, because the 11-course meals would go on for a couple of hours, and it would be hard to imagine a child in any class sitting through that.
He says, well, two things. I want to ask, is it all right with you if I stop your screen share so that people can see what you're doing just a little bit better?
Yes.
Okay. And then the second thing is, he says, I wonder just how much they ate. So
how much they ate.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, good question. And we don't know much about that. And it's interesting you bring it up, Ramon, because there are a lot of studies about the games that children play and the games on board and so forth. So it would be interesting to find out more about how they ate. And I'm only just assuming that they probably ate in their quarters with their nannies. I'm going to point out real quick here, and then we can take another question. This recipe calls for yogurt, for plain vanilla yogurt, and it is so good. This really is. I was thrilled with how this recipe turned out. And I use my hands. Do not be afraid to mix with your hands. The butter, you put the butter in little pats, and you don't want it warm or room temperature. You want to make sure you have kind of a little on the chilly side. Keep your butter as cold as you can so that you can still get into your dough and mix it. Can everybody see how I'm mixing this with my hands?
I can see it.
I'm kind of scooping along. I'm sure most of you have already seen this, but for everyone's benefit, I just want to make sure I share this. I was fortunate to grow up, watching this every day at my home growing up, but I want to share it for people that maybe have never made scones before. So I kind of go along the side of the bowl and really blend it in good. And one of the things I wanted to make sure I shared with you all tonight is that make more of the roasted rhubarb that I put in the recipe, because you want to put some on top too, and be generous with it, because remember, we're not going to get rhubarb for a long time again. So put as much rhubarb as you want into this, and you might get a moister scone, but you know what? It'll be so good. Here, I'm going to put the roasted rhubarb in. I'm going to put half in, and then the rest of it, I'm going to, after it bakes, I'm going to put that on top so that it'll look like this, like the scones here where you can actually see the pretty rhubarb. One of the things I love about rhubarb is that you can see the little bit of red peeking through. And when you clean your rhubarb and trim it, make sure you leave a little red of the peel on there so that you can, see a little color, because otherwise it's just kind of a light green. So I'm going to mix this really good. And are there any more questions?
Yes. So we have a couple here. One question is, how many chefs or cooks were on board Titanic?
Oh, goodness. There were so many. And, there were a lot. And the exact number, I don't have in front of me of what we think was the exact number, but we actually don't know for sure because of the records that were kept. So we don't really have an exact number anyway, but for sure, dozens. And many of them, their stories are told in my book, The Last Sit on the Titanic, Unsinkable Drinking, Dining in Style. The head baker is one of my favorite stories. Charles Jockin, who many of us know, who survived after he had been drinking heavily, and he managed to survive. He's one of the most beloved of the crew of all the stories. And just real quick here, I'm going to put some butter in the bottom of the cast iron skillet, and I'll go through this. But again, I'm not 100% on the numbers of bakers and cooks. Many of the people that were working aboard the Titanic were from another ship, from the Olympic. Many of them had worked aboard the Olympic, and they were so anxious to get out again to work that they took jobs, like in Charles Jockin's case, he took a job as a baker, even though he was a French pastry chef, trained as a French pastry chef. So people they transferred over when they could from Olympic to the Titanic to get some work. And they were willing to be open and flexible to do, a lot of different things that they normally wouldn't do. This is what it looks like in the cast iron skillet. And then I'm going to sprinkle this with large sugar crystals to make it taste really a little sweet, and put that in the oven for about, like I said, 30 to 40 minutes until it starts to brown.
So how did they keep all the meats and foods fresh and cold on Titanic? Do you know?
Well, there was electricity for one thing, and there was ice in many cases. we were really, the history of the world was at that point of transitioning to where electricity was more popular. So it was a hybrid of a few different things. And that was one of the things too that made Titanic so remarkable, that they could keep things cool.
Right. And then I have another question. For anyone who was less than thrilled with the menu items, would the people in first class be able to ask for custom food?
Yes, well, in the Cafe Parisien, for example, they could order in different things that they wouldn't get in the first class dining saloon. And also the a la carte restaurant, they could order things that were a little bit different. And I'm sure they did, Kim. I'm sure they had, custom orders, and I'm sure there was actually a lot of that.
All right. I don't have, if anyone else has any more questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat while we're wrapping up. Veronica, did you have any last remarks that you'd like to make?
Well, boy, we're almost right at the hour here.
Mhm.
I just really want to encourage everybody to continue learning about these stories and honoring the legacy that the Titanic gives us, continues to give us. I almost said gave us, and she just still continues to inspire and inform and interpret. Have some people in this summer, make some pre-prohibition cocktails or some fun scones like this, and talk about why you chose to make rhubarb scones. If you can get rhubarb in the summer, or make some kind of scones, you can. That's one thing I wanted to point out too, is you can make these scones with blueberries, strawberries would be good. Anything like that that's seasonal, apples in the fall. So keep your interest going. In these recent years have been so challenging, and I've continued to be inspired by the people that I learned about through my book and before my book. And I hope that you all will be inspired by so many of these people as well.
Do you want to answer one or two last questions?
Yes.
Okay. So Jill would like to know if you've been to the Molly Brown House Museum. I think that's really important, so I wanted to ask.
Yes, good question, Jill. And the answer is absolutely. And I have to tell you all that if you could, it's one of those places of, if I could snap my fingers, I would go back to the Eiffel Tower, to New York City. And one of the places I would wish I could snap my fingers and go back is the Molly Brown House Museum. It just, it takes you back in time. It celebrates that amazing woman and all the things she loved so well. And it's one of my favorite places in the world, truly.
Oh, thank you. I just want to get to these last couple of questions while we have like 4 minutes. Ramon says, I think they had pigeon at the final dinner. Is it still possible to have that in the United States? Do you even know what it tastes like?
I have not seen pigeon on a menu, but I'm really glad that you brought that up, Ramon, because there was a bird on one of the crew menus for the sea trials on April 2nd, and it was plover. And I looked it up, I thought, oh, what is plover? Well, it's a seabird, okay? So I thought, wow, the people that planned these menus out for the crew, they really put thought into it, and here was a group of people eating that had dedicated their lives to working at the sea, and they knew that wasn't lost on them. And so pigeon I haven't heard of, but for sure quail and plover and other seabirds.
All right, one last question and then we'll be done. Were there any trendy diets at the time that would have been incorporated into the menus?
That is a great question. The reason I love it is because it really illustrates the differences between modern day and those days. And there weren't any like Atkins diets, or not that I'm advocating for that, but there was no vegan. Nowadays you go to the restaurant and you see a vegan recipe and a gluten-free, even in my early adulthood, that was unheard of, to be able to go into a restaurant and see like GF next to a menu item. So definitely not on the Titanic, and certainly not in third class. And I have never seen a first class menu. I did read Kristen Iverson's book about Margaret Brown, and I think there was a section that talked about her really being careful about her weight. And people don't know this, but she was actually a smaller woman and in her weight, because she took really good care of herself, and she would walk on the deck. And bless Kristen for highlighting that, because it's really important that we know that about Margaret.
Well, I just want to take a moment and thank you, Veronica, for this wonderful talk, for sharing your recipe with us. I can't wait to try it. I have a monstrously overgrown rhubarb plant in my backyard that I will be taking advantage of. For anyone who is interested in joining us in further episodes of our Deeper Dive series, our next one will be June 18th with Charles Haas. If you are in the Denver area, you can join us live at Talnua Distillery, and you'll get a whiskey tasting before the talk. And then Charles is going to zoom in to the distillery to join us, so people can join us virtually or in person. And then we will have talks in July, August, September, and all of those tickets for registration should be coming up online within the next week or so. So keep your eyes peeled. I put the URL to our Titanic page. It's just mollybrown.org/Titanic in the chat. And I will share out with all of you a recording of tonight's talk tomorrow. So if you came in late or you had to leave early, this way you'll get to see it. I will apologize into advance. I forgot to hit the record button until about 5 minutes in. So the first 5 minutes will be missing, and that is on me, and I apologize. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, for Veronica, for sharing all your knowledge. We really appreciate it.
Tim, thank you. And don't you worry about that record button. It gave us a chance to get rolling. So yay. Thank you for a wonderful program.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And go and make some scones.